Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Maestas, the director of the Collaborative Journalism Resource Hub. A very quick personal caveat. I have an errant smoke detector that was going off all morning trying to fix. It stopped. If you start hearing a beeping in this minute that I'm going to do the introduction, it is not yours. You do not have to get up and run from room to room looking at your ceiling trying to figure out which one it is. It's all me. So don't worry about it, and hopefully it won't go off again. Thank you for showing up today for what's going to be a useful webinar about how your collaborative or any collaborative can work with data. We're happy to have longtime data journalist Sandra Fish here with us to lead this webinar. Sandra specializes in political reporting. She is, in her own words, semi-retired. She has worked most recently at the Colorado Sun. She's also worked for New Mexico In Depth and other news outlets. She was a journalism instructor at the University of Colorado Boulder for 8 years after a newspaper career in Iowa, Florida, and Colorado, where she resides now. Before we get started, I want to just share a couple pieces of information. Our next monthly webinar will be held on Tuesday, October 28th. It'll be led by Danny Hayes, and he's going to talk about how the statewide news collective devised a method to measure hard to track community impact. Delaney will put a link to that information about that. We will have a link to sign up for that webinar in our next newsletter, which will come out next Friday, a week from this Friday. Speaking of, if you don't subscribe to our newsletter, you can sign up today to learn about collaboration. It's sent out every 2 weeks, and about upcoming webinars we will be hosting every month. We will have that webinar in late October. We will take a break in November and December because of holidays and start on January. If you ever have any ideas for webinars that you'd like collaborative related, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. We have some exciting ones coming up. Delaney's going to drop the newsletter sign up link in the chat. Today's webinar will be recorded. After this, afterward, we will email the recording of the webinar as well as Sandra's slides and a tip sheet that she has put together for everyone. So now I will turn this over to Sandra.
Thank you, Amy and Delaney, for inviting me, and Joe for your work here. So I have some slides to share. And, it's like, this is a common thing of using data to collaborate, and it can be odd to navigate, or it can be really cool. And I'm hoping to show you some cool ideas today. Going to talk about defining roles, tasks, duties for people, talk about knowing the data, where it came from, talk about analyzing the data, which is a key portion of things, and it's maybe surprising how that works. Documenting your analysis and transparency, reporting beyond the data, and a little bit about presentation of the data. So one of the examples, primary example I'm going to use here today, actually, this happened after Amy invited me to do this webinar, and I did the data work for a collaboration with the Colorado Sun and WyoFile on ICE arrests. And some of you might be, if you're interested in immigration, back in sometime in June, this project at Berkeley Law School got this detailed ICE data, and they released it, and most people were analyzing the arrests. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this worked out, but we ended up, the Sun asked me to work on it with them, and then I said, why don't we include Wyoming, because they're in the same ICE detention district as we are. And that was sort of my idea. It was like, wow, I think, to be realistic, we had been beaten by the Denver Post on looking at the arrest data, which was the primary data that you needed to look at here. So I said, let's include WyoFile. One of the things that I would suggest to people is thinking about who it is you're collaborating with and what are their roles. Um, Probably you're going to have a data journalist crunching the data, which I was. I wrote some of the story that was about the data and helped with the graphics, that sort of thing. You know, you may have also other reporters who do on the ground things. And Taylor Dovin and Andrew Graham at WyoFile did a lot of talking to different people in Colorado and Wyoming. And that was doing this together was really effective because not only did it encompass a single ICE district, it also contrasted two very different states. Colorado, where it is prohibited to for local law enforcement officials to cooperate with ICE, and we've had some interesting news on that in the past few months, and Wyoming, where anybody can cooperate with ICE. And so you could sort of show the difference between the two states. And the reporters did a great job with that. We met with our editors once from both organizations, and then just we reporters talked among ourselves, um, and by text and email, and sometimes by phone, because it took us a little while to get through this. But you might want to have a graphics person who does the graphics. I know one of the guys at the Sun totally redid the graphics I had. Photo, you might not always have people from photo in on this early, but eventually you're going to have them. And I remember the Sun sent somebody out to the weekly ICE detention facility protest on Monday evenings to get a photo for this. And the digital presentation, one of the things that I've seen that I'll just have a slide of later, from Chicago on missing women, their digital presentation was spectacular. And but there's a process for all this. And I would add here that if this is a big project, if it's like super large, you want to think about having a project manager. It might be one of your editors, it might be one of the key reporters, it might be a data journalist, but if it's a big thing, you need to try to set deadlines and see where people are at periodically. I have several friends who work at ESPN, and a couple of them published really long or things that they'd worked on for more than a year, in some instances too. I'm not sure how their well, they do have project managers there. Sometimes it's an editor, sometimes it's someone different. Um, and just having somebody that is the point person can be very important here. Sometimes you are working with somebody who's doing the data and you're doing the reporting, and that's part of the collaboration. And you have to think about here, where did the data come from? Government data is something that we often use, and I have a huge beef with these people. I feel like government collects a lot of data and they often don't even look at it. Um, and I'll get into some of this, the caveats of government data. It can be difficult. Um, Academia, you might get data from an academic source, and I think you have to ask, how did they compile that data? Or a think tank, um, or a think tank or academia. I think it's important to ask where they got the data, how they compiled it. Um, you might be using a scientific poll, although that's more of a daily sort of thing. It might be crowdsourced information. And I think that 40 Acres and a Mule did some crowdsourcing on helping people looking at documents and entering what those documents said. Also, there's a project at the University of Minnesota that a friend of mine works on, and they get multiple people to do data entry and then try to make sure that things are consistent and things have been correctly entered. So it's important to think about, where does some of this stuff come from? Um, you know, you also need to ask these questions about the data. How is it obtained? Is it original? And I have done projects several years ago for ESPN. And what a nightmare. I did a project where I collected food inspection reports from 111 major league sports venues in North America. And this just involved a lot of, you know, some you could download directly from a website, some you could request the data. Other people were giving you PDFs, some of them handwritten. Thank you, Nashville. Um, and and so I did a lot of data entry myself. It's important to think about the data entry. Um, who entered it? A lot of government data. Government data is entered by people. I've worked a lot with lobbying and campaign finance data, and it can be problematic in that humans are entering this data and they don't always type well. Um, I would ask too, is it the full data set? Um, I feel like there are some instances, you know, there, I think there's some friction between TRAC, which has been based at Syracuse, and the Berkeley group that's releasing this ICE data. And the Berkeley group is just, here's the data, here are our caveats. TRAC has been requesting similar, but it appears different data for a long time. And they don't show you what is behind the data and how they've cleaned it up. Um, other news organizations, I did not mention that. And there are news organizations like the Washington Post is one, Marshall Project also, who are sharing data that they're collecting. The Washington Post, if you're doing anything on gun violence, police violence, they have some data on their GitHub site, especially about police shootings. That is super useful and that you can download and localize for yourself. So other news organizations, and they're entering it. I feel like they're reliable. You can go back if you're looking at specific instances, you probably want to go back and, you know, verify that specific instance and get more information about it. So our data source is this academic project called Deportation Data Project at University of Colorado, Berkeley School of Law. And this is their homepage. They they've gotten this data through FOIA requests. And it's, their latest release they got, I think, sometime in August. I would expect them to come out with something new. This data came with a lot of caveats. They've had 3 releases so far. And their first 2 releases, they had data about people who'd been released. And then they decided that the stuff that they got I think, in August didn't line up for them. So they were like, we're not posting this data. Now, I would add that today they did go through the data more, talked with ICE a lot, and they have posted these removals through late July. And so this is one of the caveats too, is that people change the way they're doing things. One of the things that with this data is that the unique identifiers in this change with every release. And they have a great FAQ there that talks about all the things that you might have questions about. And, it was a challenge to work with this data for the first time because you've got numerous tables and all sorts of things that you have to consider. Um, I would note that, well, this is where you get to how is the data being analyzed. It's really important to keep a record of what you're doing and of the steps that you're following and thinking about how you're going through this because you need to have other people let them know how you've done the analysis if you're the data person. And if you're not the data person, you would like to know how they did the analysis, just for your purposes. So like I usually have a Google Doc or an Evernote file. Um, I'll show you the way I usually analyze things where I also explain things in a programming fashion. Um, the software that you're using is important. And I would say if you have a lot of data, like I'm reluctant to do more than maybe 50,000 rows in Excel just because there may be a lot of things in there that you can't necessarily see. Um, and so you might want to use something, you would want to use something like more sophisticated, like say, some sort of SQL database like MySQL or Postgres. You might want to use a lot of people use RStudio. I myself use Python pandas, and I'll show you an example of that. You know, you have to think about, are there duplicates? That's one of the big things of like looking for duplicates. Are there things that are duplicated and how, do you keep them? Do you leave them out? There's a lot of judgment calls. And I'll tell you, a lot of this data needs to be cleaned up. Um, the Excel issues, there's a woman named um, Charlie Jarvis, who I believe she's in prison now, and for defrauding financial institutions. And the way they found out was that some of the analysts at these institutions, one of the employees noticed that every one of her files was the maximum number of rows in Excel. There's your trigger. Excel isn't going to read more than 1,048,576 rows. Problematic. There's something that data journalists refer to as date magic in Excel, where you might import a comma separated value file and all the dates are just like these strings of numbers, which you can go up and change the format to date or short date, and it fixes it. But it also, you might enter 12.5 and it translated to a date. And again, you can go up to the format and fix that, but it can be confusing. Um, and it's another reason not to like Excel. And you can also have more columns, end up with more columns than the database can handle. And back in 2020 in the UK, COVID cases suddenly spiked because, and and it was because for a few weeks, um, they had been entering this in Excel and it did not work for them. And then they realized that the cases had exceeded the limits of Excel and that you need to use something else. So be mindful of that. I mentioned I use Python and pandas, and this is just an example of my ICE thing where it is sort of a data programming thing, there are a lot of resources out there, or if you were going to do this yourself, if you ever went to NICAR, there are really good sessions on how to use this software. And and this is an instance where you can actually say, what you're doing, download the zip file, their text files, save them as comma separated files. Um, they're the unique identifiers change with each release. So if you're looking for a specific person all the time, you want to know the details about that person, and that's pretty detailed. You know, you can see that over here, like when I am trying to just get the arrests for my Colorado area, I'm looking at arrests where the apprehension was in the Denver area of responsibility, or the apprehension state was Colorado, or the state of Colorado, or the state of Wyoming. Um, I love this old tweet from this guy who's gotten his PhD at Harvard and, lawyer. And what percentage of your time do you spend fitting the model? Me, a data scientist, 2%. Lawyer, the other 98%, me cleaning the data. Everyone gasps. It's kind of true. And as he says, I'm not happy about it either. And depending on your data, it's really important that somebody is spending a lot of time looking at it. Um, a couple of examples, like my favorite from New Mexico is, wow, people spell Albuquerque so many different ways. It's just like, whoa. And truth or consequences, T or C, not everybody can spell consequences. Um, Complicated word. And then if you look at my original arrest data here, you see that the state is blank in like 900, almost 1,000 instances. Um, and that can be problematic and you have some people from Florida, Louisiana that are in theoretically this area, but it's unclear. So you have to, that was a huge part of this ICE data, was figuring out which of these cases to delete and which to keep, and how to improve um, on those blank state information, which there were a couple of ways you could do it. One of the ways I did it was to join it with another table that had state information and try to deduce it from there. And I'll show you a little example. It's important to ask other people for reviews. Like my friends Paula and Shui analyzed officiating from 2010 to 2024 in NFL games, and everybody yelling at those bad calls in the Broncos game last night is probably wrong, but or according to their analysis. But one of the things they did was go back to this, was to get this professor, statistics professor at a business school at University of Alabama, to help them in their analysis. And when we did this restaurant inspection things, it's important to go for your data journalists and your reporters to really ask questions of each other and of your sources. Um, when I did this food inspection report, we went back to all the inspection authorities at these venues and said, here's what we have. There was one, Detroit, that had been super rude to us when we requested the data. Like I ended up having to go to like the city ombudsman or something. Um, Paula spoofed her phone number once and the woman answered. And when she realized it was Paula, she hung up on her. And like about a year later, when we're going back to her with this data, she's like, oh, let's have a phone call. I think you're missing some things. I can get you some more stuff. And that was very helpful because we were missing some things. Sometimes people aren't going to have the data. Like in that instance, um, Washington, D.C. had consistently inspected the Nats stadium, but they had not been to the hockey and NBA venue. I can't remember what it's called these days. we were looking at 2 years of data, and they'd been there once after there was a food disease outbreak. And they did only inspected a handful of places. And when we went back to that guy, I mean, I'd called him, I'd looked at the website, called him again, and he was like, well, we did some inspections in 2018, in spring of 2018, which was right before the hockey playoffs were going to start. And that was the first time they'd inspected the place in like the entire place on the routine in like 3 years. So some places you're not even going to get anything from. But it's important to go back to the sources and ask questions. And it was really helpful for me to have Taylor and Andrew asking me a lot of questions during the process. You know, once you've got the data analyzed and you may go back, I should mention that on that ICE data, I analyzed it 3 times before I was satisfied with it because I hadn't used it before. It was relatively new. It was, like I said, it was very helpful to have Taylor and Andrew ask me questions. Taylor actually knew somebody at the New York Times who was working with this data and told them what we were doing with it and how we'd gone about it. And that person validated our methods, which was a relief. Um, I'd done this 3 times, and then a couple of days before the story was supposed to run, they released some new data. So I got to do it again. But I felt pretty good about it. And, we had things from the big picture to smaller details. And really the big picture with this data is what's changed from say 2024 to now during the same time frame. And that's that in 2024, most of the people, like 70%, I think, had criminal convictions of the people arrested by ICE. And this year, that is quite different. Now, a lot of people have been charged criminally, but they haven't been convicted yet. And there's a significant number of people who have no criminal conviction or charges on their record. And so that's kind of the big picture, is that many of these people have not been convicted, far more than in the past. And then you can get into these smaller details of, well, what are the charges people have been convicted of? In Colorado and Wyoming, the top charges are drunk driving. Is that what, we consider a super serious crime? And there are other things that are, very few of these people have committed, like very few have committed murder or even assault. And then you can get in, we dove into details like how many people were Venezuelans who'd been sent to the place in El Salvador. So, to me, I'm always looking at that big picture of the data and then progressing downwards to get into detail that make this a story. Um, at some point, once you've got that big picture with the data to smaller details, you need to talk about are you going to write a single story? Are you going to write multiple stories? What kind of structure are you going to use? Um, and that's something you can either have, just like with us, it was just like the reporters, we're talking about it. Okay, now this is ready for an editor. It's important to find the real people. Um, who's impacted by this? I think we talked to mostly officials for this story, but we had some good anecdotes about, you know, people in Wyoming who, yeah, they're cooperating with ICE, and suddenly, they've got a lot of people in jail and this, that, and the other thing. I mean, there have been subsequent stories, and I'll show you some of those, but if you can find real people to illustrate this story, it's it's really, really important. And also thinking about, what are the photos? What are the graphics? Um, it, you know, if you, sometimes your data person is going to be the person who can do the graphics for you. Um, but I think it's important if you're using data to use those graphics. That's one of the advantages we've had. Uh, the Denver Post has done this story now a couple of times. They did it in August when I was on a long vacation. Um, and they never use any graphics. They just use numbers. And I think the graphics are good. Using what is called by data journalists a nerd box is also important. Um, I really, I'll show you my example of that, and which was a really detailed one in the instance of this particular story. You know, Thinking about digital, is this a really, really big package that you want people to be able to explore? I think Missing in Chicago, that was done by City Bureau and Invisible Institute there, is a really beautiful digital example and an also just a really moving story that won a Pulitzer Prize. 40 Acres and a Mule is another thing that had, audio with reveal, but also a really great digital presentation. And so if you've got people in your network of collaborators, you want to rope them in. Once you have the data analysis, that's just a portion of it. You've got to spend significant time, oftentimes. How are you going to present it? What are the stories? How can we make this really sing? Are we going to do a podcast? To be honest, I'd love to have somebody teach me to use TikTok better. Um, to be honest, I would be trying to do a series of TikTok pieces or just short videos, I should say, of that you can share out there on social and and hopefully draw some different audiences into your story and your presentation. Like I think when you can do a digital thing like Missing in Chicago, I mean, once people click on it, they're going to stay there for a while because it's pretty fascinating. But I understand that not everybody has the resources for that. Um, you know, we did an initial story, but then these two reporters have done a ton of follow-ups. You know, like Andrew found um, a Cuban immigrant who was from Miami, who'd lived in Miami forever, and then suddenly got sent to Wyoming, um, to Casper. And I'm not sure where he is. Most recently, I don't think I've got this in here, but most recently, Andrew did a story about one county sheriff actually contracting with ICE to use his jail in order to give his deputies raises. That's what he's going to do with the money. Um, Taylor has gone and found some people who, one woman who had a job and was taken away, and then people at this factory that depends on immigrant labor are they don't want to come to work anymore. And there are questions about whether or not the sheriff's office cooperated. There are also questions in Colorado about whether the governor's office and the executive branch. So there's a lot of stories, and I think, some of these things probably are from people contacting these reporters because they've done one story and it builds into others. You know, this transparency, this is, excuse me, I really wanted to be very detailed about how we did this because there are quite a few people, both nationally and locally, and I wanted to that are using this data, and I wanted to explain in great detail, you know, save the tables as really detail as comma separated files, imported them, narrowed the tables to data that included the Denver area of responsibility, Colorado, or Wyoming. There's detention data, and I used facilities that were in Colorado and Wyoming by identifying them and creating a list. And then I used the helpful thing about this Berkeley data is that they've got specific unique identifiers that you can match across tables. So we added like the most serious conviction charge from the to the arrest data, from detention data, and there are detainer data too that have additional state information. That was super helpful. And then we narrowed the time frame so that we're comparing the same time frame in 2024 to 2025. Um, in the end, we had 41 records where we couldn't, out of 999 blanks, where we couldn't determine the state. But, and there were quite a few, there were some duplicate records. Um, Sometimes they were arrested in both 2024 and 2025, and we kept them in there because they'd been released in 2024. Um, in the end, I do go back to Excel. I used Excel pivot tables to do a lot of the analysis and create those charts. But you know, and you'd also, I'd note that I added this. It's worth noting there's no way to gauge the accuracy. Um, Three of the records removed listed locations in Colorado or Wyoming, but apprehension states of Florida and Utah, and you just didn't have enough information about those. And you know, where on the food inspection reports, people got back to us, people were willing to talk about that. If you look at this story, which is linked in the slides, ICE really doesn't want to talk about it. They they provided this data under a Freedom of Information Act request, but they act like they have no way of knowing if it's accurate. And it's true that it wasn't like this data appeared out of thin air. Individuals input it. Like there's some things that say California that I bet people just didn't use the drop down menu correctly and get to CO from CA. And there's no way to know that. You have to, there are judgment calls that have to be made. So, okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm wondering what questions you have.
Feel free
Uh,
to ask Sandra questions. Collaborative. This is audience is largely collaborative people who are working with multiple newsrooms, news organizations together. I know that we have um, uh, a couple of people here who are have data partners with collaboratives. Delaney, you can explain that. But if you are wondering how you have multiple news organizations, where you start, some tips from Sandra on how to get started. It's easy, and well, I would not want to say easy, but it's common to understand how one news organization can do this. But when you have multiple working together, maybe some, if you have questions around how you start, defining roles when you have multiple hands involved in this, feel free to ask questions. Joe, did you have?
Yeah, I was wondering, this has been excellent. And I was wondering, in your opinion, what do you think is a better approach when it comes to getting everybody on the same tool or platform? Do you take the meet them where they're at approach and try to create as much communication and data redundancy as possible for those who aren't familiar with various tools or platforms? Or do you take a more hardline approach of, setting expectations at the beginning of a collaboration and sort of doing your best, albeit without any real enforcement mechanism, to get people to add that platform or dashboard or central thing as part of their workflow? What do you think is the best approach in your?
That's a really good question. And I think that I probably go with the meet them where they're at. But, like I think that WyoFile typically does their graphics and data wrapper, which I love data wrapper. It's like a really good online, simple, I think it looks really good, but the Sun uses Flourish, which has so many choices. It's a very difficult thing to adjust to. Um, and so you kind of have to go between, I think in the end, everybody used Flourish embeds in that. I think, I would love to do this again sometime with one of my friends. I don't know that we have any money to do this, but um, I would love to do this analysis next time with a friend who uses our studio, just to see how it works for them. And I think making, if you have like two data reporters in a collaborative, having them work together, and even if they're using different platforms, different software, I think that could be a really great thing, because then you come up with, and I've shared um, my Python notebook with at least one person who asked about it in North Carolina. Um, I should check back in and see if she used it, but I mean, it would need changes because she's in a different state. But I think I think it is good to think about that up front, though. Who is going to do the data analysis? It isn't. Now, in some instances, everybody might be collecting data. It might be a roll your own, like that food inspection thing was. And I've done other projects, like I FOIA'd a bunch of FOIA stuff earlier this year of last year's requests, and just like had a form so people could input it. And I think that that's something where you probably do want, if you're creating your own set of data based on information that people in the collaborative are doing, I would highly recommend like a Google form fed into a spreadsheet that you can look at. And one person who's coordinating how that spreadsheet is set up and is going to look closely at the data, because I've been in a situation where I ended up being the person to analyze such a thing, and I ended up redoing a lot of the work because it wasn't consistent.
And then
Joe?
one follow-up for that, because I don't see any in the chat, otherwise I would shut up. Um, you mentioned the project manager or project coordinator is super important, and we found that very similarly important. What are some key skills? Do they have to be well-versed in data journalism and data reporting necessarily, or if not, or if so, what are some other core skills you think are really important to look for in a project manager or coordinator for these kinds of collaboration?
I think organizational skills and the ability to like organization and communication are the important things there. And getting everybody on the same page in terms of, where are we going to communicate? Are we just going to text because there are only three of us? Or are we going to do we have a separate Slack channel for this project? And how are we going to share the information? And especially, how are we going to set deadlines? I mean, if you're working on something that's as massive as 40 acres and a mule, or the Chicago example, you're probably not going to have hard deadlines early on, but at some point you do need to have those. And, when are people going to, you know, setting those deadlines and having periodic meetings, just keeping people on track. You don't have to be a data expert. And in fact, like I said, I appreciated having people who don't do as much data work asking me questions.
Yeah, that's a good comment related to Jenny's question in the chat about best practices for cleaning the data if you don't have data journalists on staff. Often collaboratives have, they can be news organizations that are big, legacy news organizations who may have people who have a lot of data experience, but then sometimes one person news organizations, somebody who doesn't have any data experience at all, and as a collaborative, they're all trying to cooperate, work together, and benefit from this. So Jenny's asking, her question is that she's the top editor, but not a data journalist, so she needs to build that into their fact-checking process. Um, and what best practices if you don't have data journalists on staff and need to hire people to be part of that process.
You know, the thing about cleaning the data, one of the things especially if it's something that you can look at in Excel, is I will both filter the data and start looking at things like the city name, the state name. Are there things that are out of place? And then looking at those individual line items to see if, you know, can they be fixed manually in Excel by moving some things around? And I'm usually, let me say, I would always, I'm saving the original and I'm working from a copy. And because that's another thing about Excel, you can mess things up in there and you need to have the original available so you can go back to it. Um, and maybe start all over. Um, you know, to me, one of the most common things is misspellings or incomplete information. And I loved in the past when governments are like, we don't want you to have the data, you'll manipulate it. It's manipulated. Yeah, I'll correct your misspellings, okay? I mean, there's a lobbyist in Colorado who is putting an F in the state name in Colorado ski country. And just, I finally mentioned it to the Secretary of State, and I think that they like somehow like took it out themselves and got her to stop it. But just um yeah. But you know, you if it's small, you might be able to do that. But if it's a larger sort of thing, you do want to have a data journalist looking at it. Um, and let me tell you, there are quite a few people who are now independent data journalists. Like that's kind of what I call myself, although I also say I'm kind of retired and I work on some things and, occasionally and that sort of thing. You know, on Data Wrapper, um, I really like Data Wrapper, and I've used that in the past for like campaign finance and lobbying stories and things like that. And I would prefer it. Um, and over Flourish because it's easy, it has some constraints on it. Like one of the things about Flourish is they'll allow you to make a pie or donut chart with like 15 or 20 items. Do you want 1/20th of a slice of pie? No, you don't. And they also, the other thing about Flourish is they just have this these color palettes with a gazillion different colors, and it can be kind of difficult to change it to your own. And there's no ability, at least the last that I've seen, to adapt for color blindness. And Data Wrapper has adaptations for color blindness. Now, if you really wanted to get into more fancier, like motion sort of things and that sort of thing, I am a I am very simple. Um, and so I just want these plain charts with colors that make sense. Like they're either certain colors of red, blue, and purple, or they're, branded colors or something like that, and different, um, in different hues and tints. Um, but, you know, I am not a fancy graphics person. Some people have like, I have a friend who's done the graphics for some of my stories in the past, and she's done them using Adobe Illustrator. I mean, she's like a former AP graphics editor. I mean, she's really good, and I'm not that good at presentation.
So
But
Sandra, would you to on that, and then there's a really, really good question in the chat. Would you say that when these collaboratives, because of, again, they're a mix of news organizations, to tell a data story, to tell stories with a lot of data, I think some people might think you have to be pretty fancy at the graphics. You have to have a graphic representation here to tell the stories. Um, and I hear you saying that that's maybe not true. And then Michelle asks a really good question, which is probably the question We will always be asking in everything here going forward, what's your opinion on using AI, especially related to the data, which may be helpful for collaboratives and trying to work together that don't have a lot of data journalists experience.
You know, this is a very good question. And I'm going to have to go to LinkedIn for a quick moment here. I don't know if I can find this or not. Okay. I'm going to try to share this LinkedIn post because I love this. Jeremy Merrill from the Washington Post recently said, he just included a slide that he'd done, a principle for AI and news gathering. Don't use AI unless you can tell if it's giving you the right or wrong answer. i.e., if your mom says she loves you, check it out. And I think that's a useful thing. I use AI in some of my Python programming. I used it a little bit in creating the script I eventually used to analyze the ICE data. It isn't always correct, and it's pretty clear if it throws an error, I can identify that and fix it. I am reluctant. I think there are some things to like, writing news summaries or suggesting headlines. I have a project that I'm working on called Quiz the Vote, and I asked AI for a list of, I described my project and I got a list of potential names, and this is the one I chose from using AI. I think there are some uses for it, but I think, like Jeremy says, you have got to be able to identify whether or not it's telling you the right or wrong answer. It's very helpful for programming things like, how do I write code to do this? Now, actually analyzing your data, I don't know that that's always the case. I had a friend about a year ago, we were looking at some data they were using, and they were trying to get fields of text classified in a certain way, of like maybe 4 or 5 different things. And she was they were trying to use AI, and I'm like, how many rows do you have in this spreadsheet? It's like 6,000. It's not that hard. Search for the words you're looking at with the filter and then classify them in a new column. I mean, you don't, I feel like people are, oh, AI will solve all my problems. It will not.
Can I
But
just
it's
can I
useful.
add to that? Because I completely agree with everything you're saying, especially the part is if you don't already intimately know the stuff that you are having AI work on, you are ripe for embarrassing yourself, your organization, and so forth. I will say, as a caveat to the text classification and sentiment analysis, that is effectively what the tools were originally built to do, and they are still very good
Yeah.
at that. They were meant for nerds and data people and researchers. The whole explosion as a chat and search engine crap is a fluke or of history. And I do just want to show 2 seconds. I want to show you what I have used the built-in in Google Sheets for. So this is an archive I'm creating of Jay Rosen's digital work. And one thing that I do find really useful is I've pulled out the raw text of these articles, and you can come in here and type equals AI and then say classify the sentiment of this text
Oh.
colon, and then hit a comma and go over and hit that row, and it will do this, and it is actually really good. So this is neutral, and then you can take this and you can pull this down. And to be fair, sometimes you will get it'll say something like, "I'm not trained to do that" or whatever. But if you do have very simple tasks like this can be really useful because this is what they were built to do. And then again, in using when you said about using it to write code, the good thing about having it write Python in particular is that unlike having it write a sentence or summarize something, there's no wrong answer, essentially, obvious wrong answer for summaries. There are very clear wrong answers for writing code. Because when you write the code, if it doesn't work or if it's wrong, it will not work. So you can do things like take a research paper and have it turn it into a role-playing game or a quiz, and that's fine. But having it write a Python script to do data operations is a much safer one additional step to get it to make sure that if it does mess it up, it just won't run.
Yeah, I like that. And I'll just share a quote from Nikita Roy about LLMs at a presentation I saw her make about a year ago on large language models. These are not truth machines, and we should not be using them as such. I mean, even if you're using them to create summaries, you need to make sure that it's correct. I love that, Joe. That's very cool.
Yeah. Yeah, Joe did put
Copying and pasting.
put that line in there. Thanks for that, Joe.
Yeah.
If there are no further questions, we can wrap up. Like I said, we will send a recording of this with a data tip sheet that Sandra put together. Sandra, I will ask you your permission if I can share your contact information in the follow-up email that I
Totally.
sent out with people who
Yeah.
came today for questions for your collaboratives. Sandra's been doing this a long time. She's a known data journalist, has a lot of insight that she shared today. So she's yeah, semi-retired, so we'll leave it to her to say yes or no to anything,
Yeah.
but definitely knows a lot and works with some really good and reputable news organizations. Um, thank you, Sandra. We appreciate your information today. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and look for um, next month's webinar on collecting im impact. We'll hear from Danny Hayes. Thank you, everybody.